Hello everyone, my name's Ruth Claxton. I am, if anyone needs to use closed captions, they're turned on, so you should be able to switch them on for yourself using the button at the bottom of your screen. I am a white woman. I've got short, actually looks quite brown in here, but it's a bit grey hair, glasses and a green top, and I'm in front of the image behind me is of a medieval hunting trap that we'll talk about shortly. And then this is Emii. Do you want to introduce yourself, Emii?
Hello, my name's Emii. I am a brown girl sitting in a studio with like some posters in the background. I have got long black hair and I'm wearing a little gold necklace. I feel, hello.
Cool, brilliant, that was great. So we're gonna keep this quite informal. So if you have questions that you want to ask as we're going through, or things that you can either pipe up and say them out loud, or pop them in the chat and I'll ask Emii. Yeah, we're just going to do a kind of foray through, starting from the point that we know we're going to start at, and then we'll kind of see where we end up. So we're imagining this will be quite organic, so I'm really happy for it to be really discursive with you as well. So as a starting point, I thought it might make sense. So we're making an exhibition with Emii, which will open at the beginning of February next year. And we've been talking about it for, I don't even know when it was, maybe like 9 months?
Yeah, I think it was in the lockdown. The first lockdown is when we first started having a conversation about it.
Yeah, so we've been talking for a while. And I thought a good place to start would be the image behind me. I'm just going to do this so you can see it properly.
I don't know why I'm like
which is the image that Emii came to. We originally this conversation began after Emii applied actually for the EOP members show, and this I think was one of the images that she either brought to her interview or was in the proposal. I can't remember. So I thought a good place to start would be perhaps for you to talk about that image and what it is and how you got there.
Yeah, of course. So that image is from a book by a guy called Gaston Phoebus, who was basically documenting images of medieval hunting traps. And I found that book in a charity shop in Leeds a couple of years ago, and I was just really like obsessed with it because the images were very violent, but also like very, very like beautifully drawn. And I think there was something about like the way in which Phoebus like kind of writes about like the traps and like how people would have hunted game and hunted kind of like larger animals like in the medieval period was really fascinating. So it was sort of like written as a sort of storybook. I actually forgot the book at home because I was going to show it, which is not useful of me. I'm very sorry. But it's really amazing, and I feel like the copy that I have has got like all these amazing drawings. And what I really liked about it was there was something very like sculptural within the works themselves, like the objects, especially like the traps. So I actually have got some other photographs of some of the scans from the book, so I thought maybe that might be interesting to share with you. Let me just, do I share my screen?
Yeah.
Share screen. So they also like, can you guys see that?
Mm-hmm.
So there's also these like amazing within that book, these ropes that were used as nets to kind of capture animals. And I think I just was really like, really interested in how these images, specifically like the ones of the traps, could be sort of deployed as like sculptural elements, I guess, and how I think at that point I was starting to sort of think about how objects are specifically captured by museums and how they kind of go through all these like processes of armature and like the way that museums sort of navigate like visitors through these objects that have been like stolen from other areas and countries, and then like frame them in a very specific way. Felt very much like they could be tied to this like idea of like the hunting trap. So I guess that was sort of like my initial like interest with them, and then kind of the opportunity to develop that with Eastside has sort of like opened it out into a bit more like thinking about how those are sort of relational to objects. But I think I was also just quite interested in like the scale and like thinking about how people used to like build these possibly like on site to trap animals, and this sort of like vulnerability, but also this extreme complexity of like these different material forms and the shapes that they made, that they seemed very decorative. But I spoke to somebody about them recently, and they were saying that this was all like very much like imagined, as well as like it being like rooted in like the actual history of hunting traps. But that Gaston Phoebus's work has really been like, I guess he's like done like a lot of like artistic license with like how these would have been like properly like tied together, and how they would have like chased the animals into this pit. But yeah, I just thought they were like these just amazing for like images, and they just felt very like an installation.
And I wonder whether you can just talk a little bit more about that idea of capture and how you're relating that to objects in museums, and perhaps how you've been thinking how that's kind of connecting to previous work.
Yeah, I don't know whether it's maybe useful to show some like previous work of mine to sort of frame that. Hold on, I'll just get it up. So my works up until this point has been very much about kind of like three main strands in it. So there's kind of strand of thinking about how Western museums specifically like take objects and have sort of historically displayed those. So thinking about like the use of armatures in museum spaces, how those are like actually incredibly violent in their like materiality. So like them being hold on, I'll just pop this up, so that's maybe a bit better. How do I'm really bad with like this sort of technology. Okay, if I do that, is that okay? Can you see that?
Yeah.
So kind of thinking about like how objects are like framed in these spaces, that we kind of go into museums thinking that they're like these like amazing resource places and that they're places of learned history, but actually like objects have very violent histories and how they arrive to those spaces. So I was really interested in like the kind of relationship of like the object in the museum, how those are sort of displayed, and like how those are also stored. So these are like images from a film that I made called Capture. The kind of use of the armature here, like how that then like repositions the objects within like the architecture of the museum as well. So thinking about like the kind of big scale Lamassu figures that are in the British Museum, and how those are literally built within the architecture of the space. And then what that kind of tells you about the history of those objects, like whether objects actually come to museums to be like start new lives and like be within this new context where these other histories that have been like essentially told by like white people and like that interpretation, or whether they kind of come to these spaces to die because they're no longer like within the landscapes that they originally were in. And I guess for my work, like this is a installation that I did at Jerwood Arts earlier this year. I kind of make a lot of like, I guess this is one of the other strands in my practice where it's like I look at a lot about like materiality and how we can sort of create these like fake objects and monuments that are like kind of held in place to sort of think about hierarchies of objects and like the value of them also. So when things are sort of elevated like in a museological context, does that mean that they become more valuable in the way that we've sort of learned how to like approach these objects in museums, or whether or do we actually see these as like very violent in like the way that they're made? Like metal is literally like a really violent material from the off, like the way that it's been used to like make weapons throughout the ages. And then it's sort of like used as a framework for these objects that like have come out from the ground that like belong to all these different cultures and civilizations, and how those are sort of framed with one another. There becomes like this tension. But yeah, I guess like trying to sort of create like installations or like narratives. This was an exhibition that I did at the Tetley called The High Dam, where I sort of replicated this boat that was on display at Birmingham museums and galleries, and sort of like recreating or trying to reframe like these oral narratives that like, I guess the other part of the practice kind of talks about, which is like this kind of negotiation of identity and heritage, and like how a lot of my understanding of my own heritage is through my family passing down their knowledge to me through a very oral tradition, and how then that's sort of been made, and like I guess kind of trying to negotiate that through like the manufacture of like fake objects as well. So always trying to think about like hierarchies and armatures, because we love armatures in this house. We're obsessed with them.
There was an interesting thing, I can't remember what it was on, whether it was the talk you did with Griselda Pollock, where there was a conversation about how, like, that little figure that you showed in probably one of the ones that was in the film, how actually they would have been horizontal objects. But museologically, to display them, they suddenly become these kind of vertical things that look like Greek statues, essentially, rather than these kind of grave, I think you were talking about grave goods that would have been oriented completely differently.
For sure. And also like just the uses of objects throughout history, like the way that like a lot of the way that we think about objects has been like told to us through like archaeologists relating them to objects that they see in their everyday, whereas actually they might not have been used in that same way, even though they might be like a vessel form, like they could have been like upside down, or like they might not have been vases, or they might not have held wine in them. So it's like all this kind of, I find that really like intriguing in terms of like how we like negotiate objects that we kind of come into proximities with, and actually what their actual uses were, and how that sort of gets lost within histories. And then it's almost like everything is fabricated, like in a museological context. It's like going to the theatre in a sense.
Yeah, that's interesting, because well, I mean, maybe because theatricality also is something that kind of feels like it really comes through in the work as well, you know, in terms of some things being almost like they are like props or something, almost, or they're kind of setting a scene, you know. Maybe I suppose just how do you think about theatricality when you're making work or kind of developing installations? Where does it sit for you?
Because we just love drama in this house. No, I'm joking. But also, I feel like I sort of got into like making the kind of fake stonework through like having worked to do some like theatre set building, and I was really interested in the way in how, like, especially like scenographers in the theatre like use polystyrene specifically to like be able to sort of carve like brickwork or stones, or like remake these kind of environments that like for like a split second when you're watching them like in the theatre as the play goes on, like with like the sort of like lights and like the performer and the sound that happens, there's this moment where you almost believe that you're like in like a 17th century castle. And I was always really quite interested in that, and how I guess like using these kind of fake materials, or materials that like almost want to be something else, and positioning them like outside of a space that then is performed within, what then is left with them, like do they just become residues? And in some ways like it's sort of similar to the way that like objects that enter museum systems or like museum spaces kind of go through that process of like they re-theatricalize. Oh my god, I can't believe I just said re-theatricalize them. I don't even think that's a word. But there's this sort of like reframing of them as these kind of theatrical props, and how we sort of weave around them, and how they make us feel in relation to like their size, and how our bodies change in relationship to them. But I feel like I'm really interested in forgery as well, and like how to like mimic objects like through like, so plaster, it being like a reconstituted stone that's a dust, and then you add water and then it becomes a kind of new stone, and then how that kind of like embodies like the gesture that you put into that, and how that then makes this kind of new formation of a stone that is pretending to be a stone but actually isn't. And how you sort of like read that in relation to like possibly like how when you make these things that are forgeries, like how you can embody landscapes possibly from the outside into those, but also how to like play with this idea of like trickery. Like a lot of like sort of smaller objects I make are made out of like air dry clay or plaster, and then they're patinated to look like they're bronze. So this idea of playing and framing those within a gallery space on an armature, how people kind of react to them as if they are these super valuable objects, but actually they're like really crummy in a sense, because they don't actually have any relationship to like the artifacts that are found in the ground. They're like completely fabricated. They're very much like imagined in this like narrative that each kind of exhibition holds within itself. And I'm really interested in that kind of relationship of like how you might go into like the Jerwood show with the big arch. Like a lot of people thought that that was stone, and it's like it's polystyrene, and the way that these spaces make you feel through like forging things I think I'm quite interested in that, but also because I love making big things, even though I'm always like, it's so tiring, but it's really fun, like to make these things that are like really huge, because I feel like they're very like physical. Like I feel like you have to put a lot of your body into them to like make them like exist in that kind of format, and like plastering them, and it's like really disgusting and gross. And I feel like all of my poor boiler suits, just every time it's time to plaster, are just like quaking in their boots. But yeah, so I don't know if that answered your question.
I think it did. I mean, I suppose it also made me think a bit about this thing about scale. I suppose when I actually first saw your work, it was the Two Queens show, which I didn't go and see in real life, but I really remember seeing images.
Yeah.
And I think the reason why I remember it is because, or why it kind of stayed with me, was the scale of it and the ambition of it, and that these things were they weren't little small sculptures, they were kind of very present in the space, and they felt like they related to the human body then. And so I suppose, I know you've been thinking about scale quite a lot in this show, in terms of how the body would feel within this installation, but also the kind of scale of objects and where they sit. So I wondered whether, like how do you think about, or how what's the process that you're going through that's about developing, because the things in the Jerwood, you had the big arches, but then there were the very small vase. There's like details, aren't they? So like the scale shifts. I don't know what my question is. It's just like
I'll just riff off it. I feel like in terms of scale, I don't know, I feel like I'm always quite interested in like seeing objects that like build civilizations, so that are still sort of like in the world at the moment. So when you see scaffold towers, like those are still based on like the ways that like the pyramids were built, and like the way that your body like is, I don't know why my voice has gone all croaky, sorry. The way that the body like relates to that, like it feels like a very sort of like ancient process of like how things go bigger and bigger and bigger, and like the way that we've sort of landscaped and like used like geographies like to house us, I think is really interesting. And that you see that like in churches as well, and also like how museums also use that like in dioramas. So I remember going to the Metropolitan in New York, and they've got this temple called the Temple of Dender, and it's in the middle of like this crazy, like very clean, very slick hall with like these kind of like fake lakes. And the way that you feel in those spaces, it's like you sort of enter into history, and it feels very like romanticized and very like dramatic. And I cry all the time, so like I'm always just like there, just like, you bastards, you stole it, but also like it's beautiful. But I don't know, I feel like I'm interested in how you sort of negotiate space as like a visitor as well, and like how like narratives can be built like through like, I guess like rupturing like the white wall in some ways, or like rupturing the way that like a visitor might walk through. So like the Jerwood's show specifically was like, we built that like the arch in the middle so people could pass through that, because it was leading to like, the cafe space. So it's how you, or the sculptures then sort of direct you like, and almost like kind of like edgy towards like a kind of narrative. And then kind of having the smaller things, it's like moments where you like are maybe like more likely to sort of have a smaller interaction with those, and like because they're on these metal armatures, they might like kind of, because of the sort of museological way that we've been taught to think about objects of value, like have a bit more of like an intimate relationship with those, or like see them as things that are like shiny or like more detailed, therefore like having more of a history and built into them, rather than like the kind of larger architectures. But I guess like in relationship to the show at Eastside, like thinking about how to sort of like bring in like this idea of like these like entrapments and mazes, and like how the body then like works around those in relation to like larger scale objects within them as well, and like playing a bit more with like these mythologies, but also like the cladding of like so for the Tetley show, like having like all the kind of cardboard backing as well. I'm really interested in how like those materials, when they're used together, even though they're materials that you find in the house or like in all the buildings that we sort of inhabit, which are like plaster and sand and like glue and cardboard, when you use them in that specific format and like patinate them like that, they kind of are reminiscent of like the way in which we sort of like visualize the Middle East maybe, or like those textures, or like how we've maybe, because of like the media or because of like games like Call of Duty, like it's this very like dry, arid, like environment that has like all these kind of perforations and bullet holes and things that are sort of falling off. So I think like playing with these sort of landscapes or like pointers and how you visualize these spaces that are like totally imagined geographies, and the way that actually like it's not at all like that. I'm kind of interested in how to sort of like build like a world in a space. That was a really long way of going through that, sorry.
I was just wondering whether that relates to your own. I suppose you were talking about kind of stories being handed down orally and kind of an experience of living in Iraq and that culture being handed down orally. So does that kind of relate to your own, like how you've had to build or how you build a sense of that place?
100%, yeah, definitely. Because I feel like it's very funny. I think like a lot of people from diaspora backgrounds also might feel similarly in like the way that we like are brought up to sort of embody like a space of a home that you've never actually been to, and like how that home then sort of courses through your blood, and you almost like know the taste of it, and you know like how it smells and like the texture of it, because of all of these like stories that happen through like, I guess like they're very like nostalgic also, because you know, especially with like my family, they went through like or my mum's side like went through like an amputation of like they had to leave, and then like what happens when these geographies are then like amputated for like people who have lived there for like generations and generations and generations, what then happens with that when you move somewhere else because you're forced to. I think you the way that like home is remembered then sort of like integrates within like how we like start to visualize home, and like I don't know, it's really strange, because it's also like a complete like lie in a sense, because I'm just like, you know, I've spoken about this to a friend of mine who has had a similar like experience, and yeah, just how we sort of visualize like these ideas of home and like romanticize them as like the land, or like this kind of relationship that feels very close, but we've never necessarily like been there or visited or lived there. So it's very different. So it's like this, again, this like cycle of like romanticizing a place, which I feel is also very like tense, and it's very like complex, and I don't necessarily think it's a good thing either. So I think for me, like making work is a way of like trying to navigate this idea of like world building, and I think looking to like the ancient has always been something that's really important for me, like rather than looking at the like what's happening in contemporary and like in modern, because those are histories that like I've never experienced, and I don't want to like put myself onto those, you know.
Interesting. So maybe it's good to because I think what's been really interesting is kind of seeing how how all these things kind of weave together in your process of developing this the ideas that are becoming this show.
Yeah.
And I guess when I first saw the work and look, I just imagined you'd be making loads of things first, and that's where you would start.
Yeah.
But actually, it's been kind of a really, really interesting to see your process and how you've actually been reading loads. You know, you do this loads. You've been doing loads of research, haven't you? That's kind of be what the last, I don't know, 9 months or however long it's been is.
Yeah.
So yeah, just sort of be interesting to just talk through how the work accumulates, I suppose, or kind of emerges for you.
I think for me, like my process is always like, yeah, massively research heavy. And I kind of go into a lot of books, and I'm sort of like not really in the studio like making things. So like I was reading a book called The Dark Abyss of Time by Laurent Olivier, which kind of talks about archaeology and like reframing like the archaeological objects and time and memory and like what those are. And then sort of looking more into like hunting traps. I also like was just looking at just like a lot of different types of like books. So one of them is called The Graven Image by Zainab Bahrani, and like just kind of getting really into like very nerdy research about like agriculture and like implements, and like just being surrounded by these, or like I was also like reading a book about like plants and archaeology, and like trying to like build up like this sort of like I guess just like a little basket of just like loads of like ideas or like books and stuff, and then they sort of like overflow, and I'm a bit like, oh my god, I don't know what I'm doing, like it's a bit mad, and then they kind of funnel into like a drawing period, or like for me I'll sometimes also like something comes with like a title, when a title kind of emerges itself through like kind of sustained conversation around like what like the show, especially because like it was more like a proposal initially when I'd applied for like EOP, kind of going back to like, how does this sort of relate, and how do we like build it into like an exhibition? So for me, like recently, like I feel like the title came up and I was like, oh my god, okay, everything makes sense, and like, right, it all works, like they all sort of work together. But also, like, I was in France earlier this year on a residency, and I was like really researching arrows, and I was sort of thinking about like how arrows like have their own sort of language of like romanticism, how like they're very much portrayed as this very like romantic and very noble way of like being injured, like the pierce and the wound, and also like the fact that they're like, you know, like crossbow arrows are called quarrels, and I felt like that was like very poetic. And then what you store your arrows in are called quivers, and it's like all this very like romanticized poetry. And then like thinking about how that sort of could come back into the show, and like the show, which is like but looking at like hunting traps, and like how, you know, physically like this kind of object of piercing similar to an armature kind of works in a space where like you essentially build like a big hunting trap or like a maze or something that like a visitor can go through. And then the objects that then, you know, what if the armature was the arrow? So I made like these, like, I'm going to do a show and tell, made these like metal arrows, which I think will feature in the show, and sort of like then sort of recently I've just sort of been distilling like these ideas into like kind of more sculptural form. So like these drawings which kind of have like arrows kind of perforating them, and thinking about how they could kind of then become made into like large scale sculptural works that are like tethered to the space and like the narrative that's then built through the show, I guess. Here's another one. So I'm just doing a little show and tell.
And so they're much more bodily than well, you haven't done, all the previous work has tended to be more like arty, or the stuff I've seen. Well, that's not true actually. There are bodily ones, but they feel more specific.
Yeah, it's weird for me because I feel like normally like the things are way more I think when they'll kind of go into like a sculptural form, I think they still will be quite abstracted from this, because normally then like the research bit then distills into like the drawings, and then the sculptures will always be a bit more like clunky, and like they'll kind of look more abstracted, just because I feel like I don't want to necessarily make things that like I feel like, for example, if I made this into like a sculpture, I think it would just, I don't think it would work as much in a sense. But I don't know, I just think I was kind of interested in like how like this sort of like anthropomorphic, is that when like animals and humans sort of like look the same?
Yes.
Yeah, like how I have no idea.
Did anybody described it though? So
it's when you humanize objects.
Yes.
So I feel like I kind of wanted to like maybe play a little bit with that. So like having these like maybe more like thinking about like how maybe like a foot could also be like an animal's thigh, or like an arm could be like a wing or something like that. So like thinking about how like those things can kind of like intersect with each other to like play out these histories. But I think for me also just like a way of developing like my sculptural practice, like outside of like, yeah, outside of just like building like fake arches.
And so you've also been thinking about them kind of, so in terms of what, so you also went on a willow weaving course, didn't you?
I did.
So you know that kind of, yeah, like where craft skills kind of sit. I think it might be when you talked to Zelda as well, you were saying that your dad's family maybe were all builders as well.
Yes.
Kind of so yeah, it made me sort of interested in, yeah, you do talk about craft skill in quite a particular way, and so it's not about replicating, but it's about, again, it's like another tool in your toolbox almost, you know. So, yeah, maybe just talk a bit about that. And how, we were doing rope making as well, was one originally, but
yeah, we really wanted to work with like a rope maker, but unfortunately he got really ill, so he couldn't facilitate a workshop. But he was really cool, like he grew his own flax and everything, and he like made ropes. I don't know, I think there's something that's really like important about, or like I think something that I'd like to do a bit more of is like trying to learn how to like do, or like at least know the people who are like keeping these like crafts that are like dying out. So like the willow weaver Ruth was amazing, and she was just like does all these amazing like willow sculptures and also like willow weaving fences that are very much like the same way that like they would have been done in like the medieval period. And I think there's something that like is nice about the lineage of like how those skills are passed on, because they are just like almost like dying out. And I think similar to like my dad's family, like I remember learning how to gypsum carve from him, and that's like how he got taught by his dad, and like his dad got taught by his dad. So like this kind of lineage that then passes on, and like how that then is like applied to like new traditions as well. And I think that that's something that I'm quite interested in materially, like in the practice as well, like how in a sense like learning these things, but then I don't know, almost bastardizing them through like coating them in a different type of material, or like I don't know, like just like also like learning about like why it's important to like make things out of this, or like why people did used to make them, and this sort of like physical touch to like the past through like trying to replicate like the yeah, I guess like how people used to kind of work with nature, rather than just sort of being like, oh yeah, I don't know if that like really answered your question.
Yeah. And so just made, actually, I just also thought while you were talking about that, about, I mean, the interesting thing about the rope maker is that the reason why we could, like, there are no other medieval rope makers that we could find.
I know.
We almost found one connected to Tudor reenactments that my mum does, but I didn't quite achieve it. But it was surprising to me how there aren't at least like a little club of them, like a little group of people, but or you know, maybe those skills sit privately, but they're definitely not.
100%. It's really interesting. I feel like recently I went to visit an artist called Rashad Sarim, and he does like, he basically builds these boats that are called Mushkovs, and they're like these traditional Iraqi boats that were like made by the Ma'dani tribes in southern Iraq, which was this marshland, and that got drained in like the 70s and 80s, and it's like really, really sad. It's amazing. Like if you've got time to like look up the marshlands, they're just incredible. And like he basically does this restoration project, working with people in Iraq to sort of remake these like boats, and it's just crazy like how many people have just forgotten through like one generation like how those are made. So it's like, it's just the thing of like history, how like history like falls or like is so easily forgotten, like when one generation isn't interested, or like there is a rupture in where like that can't be passed down. Also, I guess like because we live in a world now where you don't just do what your dad did, these things kind of go. And I think it's really interesting when we think about that in relation to like the history books that are like, when we look at like objects in museums as well, like how they might have gone through like the same kind of process. Like are those like objects of things that had been like forgotten and then remade, or yeah, I don't know, there's this whole kind of conversation around
yeah. So I've got a little question from Rue on the chat.
Yes.
Which is a hard one. Well, we can answer this. Do you have any advice for artists who want to scale up but don't have the finances to do so?
I think that's why I use cardboard for a really long time, because I could get it cheap from supermarkets and I could get it in quantity, and then I would just try to use as cheap plaster as I could from like B&Q. So I'd buy like the big bags, so you could get them for like much cheaper than like casting plaster. So I think my practice sort of almost like grew into itself through like using like materials that like I didn't have the money to actually get those materials, so I was using like just like kind of bulk, or not bulk materials, but like ones that were just cheaper, and like they weren't supposed to do like they weren't supposed to cast. So I still use like building plaster to cast like some of my objects, because it makes more sense now, like in terms of the practice, but like also because I didn't have money to buy casting plaster because it was way more expensive. I feel like I don't know how to answer it, because I feel like I just used to look in like skips and gather things that made sense in terms of like the work, and I still think that I still do that a lot as well. But like also like maybe sometimes like asking companies or factories and stuff, like if there's a specific type of material that you're interested in, they might have like a lot of offcuts, or they might have a lot of that you can they'll give you that for free. I don't know if you have like
No, I mean, I think they're good suggestions. I mean, I think it's also worth saying that this is going to be the biggest show you've done so far.
Definitely, yeah.
And so, you know, we didn't select you to do this based on the fact that you'd already scaled up. You know, we saw the proposal and could see the potential. You know, so it's like you kind of sold the story of it. I suppose you told us the story of what it was going to be, enough to imagine that it was possible, which I think, you know, just thinking about when I used to make objects and would do quite big installations, again, similarly, like I remember having to do my first bigger show, and I was like, man, I've only done a tiny room up till now. What do you mean you're going to give me all this space? And having like mild panic, but just somehow managing to convince people it was possible. So I think it's that sometimes.
Definitely. Like that as well. I mean, like, because as like Ruth knows, she came to my studio recently, and like I feel like even now, like my studio is like, it's like filled with like old stuff, but like I don't necessarily like make a lot of the stuff here, and I'm not somebody who makes things like constantly, just because it's not how I work. So it's very much like space specific as well, and if there's like a budget included into that, that's where I'll like bring all this stuff. But I do remember when I did like the Gloam show, which was my first show that I did in 2018, like just being given that space and being like, they had no budget, like I didn't get paid anything for that, and like I was just like, oh my god, yeah, I'd love to like do this show. So like I remember like I'd saved like 100 quid, and I like was like, right, everything just needs to like be made like in that kind of thing, and I was just making it in studio. So that was like cardboard. I like remember going to Gumtree and like trying to source polystyrene, and like ended up going to some like really weird like old milk like plant, and then this guy like trying to like squaring up to me because I think he was like, well, he wanted more, and I was like trying to like haggle with him, being like, can I have it for like £15 please? And he was like, give me £30 or nothing. And I was just like, okay. So like, you know what I mean, like a lot of like finding things from like, yeah, Gumtree is amazing, like stuff like that, to get bigger scale. Like I still use Gumtree now for like polystyrene because it's so expensive to buy in like huge, because it's like 100 quid, whereas like I've got Billy, my lad from like York, who like doesn't make it for like 20 quid a sheet. So it's like stuff like that.
Which I suppose it's also a bit more eco, isn't it? I mean, I think that's one of the interesting challenges if you make objects and sculpture and things now.
Yeah.
You know, perhaps in my 10 years ago, I would just have bought stuff and like enjoyed having materials around me. Yeah. Whereas now that doesn't feel totally ethical.
No.
You know?
Also, like, I don't know, I feel like I reuse sculptures all the time. So like one of the arch pieces that was in Jerwood is now like a hand. It's like now an arm, and it's like another sculpture. So like that sculpture almost doesn't exist anymore. So like everything kind of reappropriates itself. But that's also just because of like, I don't want to keep buying in like polystyrene and kind of reusing stuff and adding to it, and like accepting that like those sculptures then die. Yeah, I don't think that answers your question, Ruth. I feel sorry, I've just gone on to like.
But I think that's an interesting point, because like, you know, I also just throw things out.
I think it really does answer the question.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I remember like speaking to Ty Shani, and they said that they like basically never have their sculptures like afterwards. They just end up destroying things or making new things from them. And like, I don't know if Luke's still in this chat, but Luke does something really similar. So I think it's really interesting, like how you kind of like use existing stuff and then have to like finally depart from it after you've kind of like thought about like the importance of like the museum object, and then like archiving it and housing it and giving it a home and or trapping it, and then suddenly it's just like you've let it go when you like reform it. I think that's a really beautiful kind of relationship.
Oh yeah, I mean it's probably more violent in the studio because I'm just like hacking bits out, like you're turning into something else, like I'm done with you. Like,
yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
But I think that's a really good way to be with your work as well, because like the danger is that you feel like you've got to save it all and then you end up with this kind of strange archive of your own that just overwhelms you, whereas actually being able to move forwards and reuse things and just see it as material in a different way.
For sure. I mean, I do need to get rid of the boat. That's something that needs to happen now. I'm like, it's not turning into anything else, it's just rotting.
Yeah. Cool. Has anyone got, I'm just aware we've got like 10 minutes or so to go. Has anyone else got any questions or thoughts or anything they want to ask? Cool.
do.
Go for it.
Hello.
Hello.
Sorry. I had a really lovely time with your film at Innoverts in the Stuart Hall Library. Just like yesterday, I went
That's so
to
nice.
I went to see it because I'd been to a talk there and I'd caught it with like half an eye, and I was like, oh, it's brilliant. So then I'd gone back to see it, and I watched it a few times with the only time that I had there, and it's really good. First of all, thanks so much. It's really good, and the whole display across the library is also very lovely. And it's the way that you speak about the life being in the gaps and the kind of cracks of the relics, but also what that means within the context of the library, of how the work, how the thinking is also in the gaps between the books, is or in the space, in the hallways that you're walking through, or the locker room or the loo or whatever, that actually that is what I really liked about your work there. I hadn't seen it before. Was the way that you would look at object and context. It's not so. I had a question about museums, also bringing in this, just a long sort of comment and question. Bringing in, I liked that actually one of the things that you're interested in is in the gaps, and it goes back to those questions of, for me, of Fred Moten's looking for the beyond the academy, like you're in the academy, but actually what you're looking at is for the world beyond the world that you're in. And these gaps then become a kind of route, or a hotline, a bat phone to knowledge or the life. And I had a question, really. I suppose my first question was, do you think we should get rid of museums? Like, are they more violent than they are useful? Is perhaps my first question. And there are other questions.
Okay. Also, thank you so much for watching the film. That's so nice, and I'm glad that you enjoyed it.
I loved it. I watched it 3 times in a row, and then I got chucked out of the library. I also have a quick question about the French and English as French subtitles with an English voiceover.
Yes.
And I wondered, for me, that was really fascinating. I speak French, so I watched it once without the English, and then the English was saying different things to not vastly different, but interestingly different translations to how I'd had it in my brain. And I wondered whether it was because the funding was part French that it had French subtitles, or whether it was this intended slipping again through the gaps of language and translation.
I think it was mostly to do because it was funded by Fluxus, and they it had to have, it was going out on like a French platform, so it had to have the French subtitles in it. So we got somebody to translate it. Because I also speak French as well, but I feel like I couldn't like translate it myself. I was like, I feel like it'll just be really crap. So I feel that's why we had the French translations. But it's interesting that you think about it in that way. I hadn't thought about that before. In relation to your first question about if we should get rid of museums, I don't know, because I feel like I criticize museums all the time, and I actually really like museums as well, even though they're just like very contested spaces. But I think it's more about reframing what museums are and like how we kind of interact with them, like whether we like see them as these spaces that like do give us knowledge, or whether they're just spaces of like flux, and like they're like what the past is can never be really erased from what their future is going to be, because it's so like integrated into them, and they're just, like their bones are just very infected from like the off. But it's maybe about thinking about how we like negotiate history as something that isn't static. And I think museums are doing like work to sort of combat that, and there's still like a long way to go. But I think it's just thinking like trying to reframe what a museum is there for, whether it's an experience, whether it's like something that is theatrical, which maybe is a very contested thing for me to say. But I think that's what I feel about them. I'm just like, maybe they're just places where we go and we reimagine things, and that's maybe okay. And it's not about like, all this like research that like this like archaeologist like back in like 1920 did, and that's what's given as truth. And I think like objects like hold so much more power than that. That it sometimes feels like no matter how much you interpret something. And I think interpretation is obviously really important because it gives context to things, but I think it's maybe like a future museum is where you can also build futures within those objects too, I think, if that makes any sense.
No, it makes lots of sense. I think museums are very theatrical places, but they often pretend not to be. I think that is a kind of weird slip they pretend, which is much like art galleries. I also had nice, it's really interesting. It's also the questions of when you say that there can be these falls between in one generation, this kind of fall of knowledge, if there's rupture, that actually that kind of sense of ruin, which has an etymology of falling in it, you know, that actually it has the fall within the word ruin is I don't know, it was really interesting listening to you thinking that as well, that actually there's this kind of, because that is also like a fissure line through all of those things. No, it's really fascinating. And I like also the questions that you bring up about structure and counter structure, that is both armature and wider context of the museum. And this kind of, I'm just going over your words anyway.
I feel like I'm so pleased that you like the film so much. I'd really recommend, there's an amazing book by Gustave Sauban, which I mentioned in that film, and called Luminous Debris, and it's incredible. It's so good. I feel like he just like nails everything, and he like talks so beautifully about like negative space and like landscapes, and do you know what I mean? He's amazing. Like but yeah, I mean, I feel when Ruth and Gab came to visit my studio, and I was just going in on like all the like just being like ruins and like trying to link everything up to like everything, and I feel like you were just looking at me like I was mad because I was just like it
was just quite a lot to coordinate in your mind in a short space of time.
I was just like, everything is a void.
What's that book you mentioned just now again, please?
I'll type it in the chat.
Oh, yeah, good.
Has anyone else got any questions, thoughts, observations, things to add?
I like the infected bones description.
They are infected bones.
Okay, anyone else? No, we're all good? Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I have something.
Oh, go
Sorry.
on, go.
Just before we go, I love like the emphasis on like arts and crafts and weaving, and kind of thinking about like these forgotten disciplines, and how you said like you wouldn't just do what your dad used to do. Just thinking about like things that I don't know, things that have been lost or aren't taught as much, but also kind of elevating the status of arts and crafts, like because traditionally you'd see like a craft object or kind of like, I don't know, let's say like Art Nouveau object or something like that in a museum situation, rather than a kind of like contemporary art space. So it's kind of like this like multiple layering and like weaving through that kind of like product, object, craft. Just a comment, I really like it.
Thanks. I mean, it's wild how like craft and arts like always have like such a separation. It's like the big battle in it, like it's like, and also just like the way that like a lot of work that was collected from not Europe was always shown in like ethnographic museums as like craft, rather than just like the heritage that it kind of actually contains, where it could have been like art or it could have craft, and also like vice versa, and like how the West kind of collects and displays work that is craft in an art space, and like how the value of that then changes. But I don't know, I just think craft is just so interlinked with like intergenerational memory and like inherited, like, because I feel with craft there's always, or like making things always comes with like a history of why those are made, and whether that's like storytelling, or if there's like, right, okay, I can't believe I'm going to like mention this thing and I'm really embarrassed about it, but actually I'm not that embarrassed about it, but like, have you ever watched Outlander?
Yeah.
All right, because there's a bit where they're like making like the blanket out of wee, and then they're like all the ladies are like singing and they're like making the blanket out of wee, and like I was just like, that's just really great. And then they're like, oh, like, so like you need to go for a piss now, and like you need to fill up the bucket, and then they like pour it on, and then they like, that's how, and like how they used to like make all these like songs to like pass that time, like goes into like creating a craft, like the embodiment then of like how those crafts then survive like after that, and like what we lose when we don't pass it along is like the songs, and also like the stench of urine.
Thanks for that.
On that note,
On that note,
I'm going to say thanks very much, Emii. That was brilliant. That was like super interesting. I'm sure we all agree that was really great. Always a treat to talk to you. So I'm just going to also say what's coming up in terms of things we've got coming up, some of which actually relate, I think, to that last part of the conversation. So this one doesn't, but from today we've got the Winter Art Fair. So EOP members online on our website selling excellent Christmas gifts for you to purchase for your friends and families, or maybe yourself, who knows. We've got a performance workshop with Will Fredo, who's one of the artists that's in Loop at the moment, that is on the 24th of November, up for booking at the moment. That will be really a really great, very practical session, I think. And then on the 26th of November, we've got Ancestry and Materiality, a talk that Yas Limas curated as part of their show. It's in the second gallery, which also has an element of that, is thinking around kind of craft skills and how they cross over different heritage. I suppose how in straw weaving is one that they've been looking at. So if you haven't been to see Woven Tongue yet, you should come and see it in the gallery. But yeah, that talk on the 26th of November might well kind of continue some of the stuff that I think we've been talking about now. So yeah, all on the website, ready to book, go for it. So yeah, so thanks everyone for coming. Thanks, Emii, again. And yeah, see you all soon.